Good morning or good afternoon or good evening, whatever time of day it is where you are. Welcome to the first day of the 2021 National Shared Mobility Summit. I'm Benji de la Peña, the CEO of the Shared Use Mobility Center. Thank you for joining us. I'm coming to you from the ancestral and unceded lands of the Duwamish and the coastal Salish. I'm an Asian man wearing black rimmed glasses and a white shirt. The summit is virtual and distributed, so we'll see you today and every Tuesday for the rest of the month. And don't forget our Thursday Echo events featuring our Mobility Justice Spotlight. I'd like to thank Uber and all our sponsors for supporting this event. As a nonprofit, our summits would run on these kinds of partnerships. So without you, we couldn't put this on. As you know, the theme of the summit is the big shift. And the scene behind me is exactly what we need to change. It's the I-5 highway in Seattle. Built to move cars running on fossil fuels, it was rammed through First Hill, a historically Black neighborhood that was decimated by redlining, and the Chinatown International District, severing those communities with severe implications on social connections and health. The pollution it generates disproportionately affects Black and brown children and households. Literally, that is structural racism and injustice cast in concrete. Last week, Seattle and the Pacific Northwest experienced an unprecedented heat wave with temps of up to 118 degrees. Yes, we need to electrify to face the climate crisis, but we also need to stop privileging and subsidizing private car use. We need more shared mobility. This behind me is not sustainable. This is not equitable. This is absolutely symbolic of what we need to change. If we're going to sink billions and trillions of dollars into new infrastructure, it can't be more of this. So welcome to this event where we'll have very provocative conversations. Check out the list of sessions on the links to the left of your screen. Participate in the chats to the right of our screen. We've got exciting conversations for the whole day, but we're going to start out with our first host, Tiffany Chu, and they're going to be talking about, she and her panel are going to be talking about how can data in and about our cities challenge the existing societal power structures. So let me welcome Tiffany Chu.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. I am speaking with you from Seattle as well. And it is an absolute pleasure for me to be here to be hosting this very important topic, which I have secretly wanted to discuss in a larger forum for many years. And when Hannah and Benji brought the idea up with me, it was such an exciting opportunity for me to gather three very illustrious women leaders who I have admired across the years of my professional career, and excited to bring to you this conversation today. So before I introduce my fellow panelists, I wanted to refresh everyone on the topic of the panel and why it is that we're discussing it. So the panel description is, how can data about our cities challenge existing societal power structures? And in many ways, the information we choose to collect about our cities and about mobility every day is a reflection of what we value as an industry. But what happens when the data does not tell the full story? What if it's simply a reflection of how things have always been done? How can we change the way we think about data so our information can challenge unjust societal structures in our industry and our communities? So before we get started, I wanted to read a passage from a book that I've been spending a lot of time with recently. It's called Data Feminism, and it's by Catherine D'Ignazio and Lauren Klein, published by MIT Press. And this book has really kind of set the stage for my understanding as a professional working in transportation with cities, with civic technology and civic data, what responsibility we hold to make sure that we're doing the right job on behalf of our communities. So I'm going to start with a paragraph from the introduction, Why Data Science Needs Feminism. The effects of privilege and oppression are not distributed evenly across all individuals and groups. For some, they become an obvious and unavoidable part of daily life, particularly for women and people of color and queer people and immigrants. The list goes on. If you are a member of any or all of these minoritized groups, you experience their effects everywhere, shaping the choices you make or don't get to make each day. These systems of power are as real as rain. But forces of oppression can be difficult to detect when you benefit from them. We call this a privilege hazard. And this is where data comes in. So without further ado, I would like to invite my co-panelists, Rebecca, Eva, and Margo, to the proverbial stage. Hey, all. Good to see you. So the way that we're going to run this session, hopefully, is a refreshing take on the many webinars you've all sat through over the past year and a half. We're actually going to structure this as not just a Q&A session. We're actually going to have each panelist introduce themselves, and not just their job selves, but their whole selves, and 2 data anecdotes or data stories that they have curated from their past work experience or professional lives, and shaped in a way that fits the topic of conversation today and why it's relevant. So we're going to have each panelist, myself included, do a quick 5-minute intro. And then after that, we'll do about 20 minutes of discussion where I have prepared a couple of my most fervent questions that I want to ask this group. And then we'll round it out with about 15 minutes of discussion and Q&A from the audience at the very end. So if you all want to write down your questions as they come up throughout the panel discussion, you can throw them in the Zoom chat, and I'll let you know when is a good time to speak up and ask them. Okay, so let me go ahead and share my screen. I have a few exciting slides. I'm not one for slides all the time, but I did think that this was actually the best format in which to share what we all wanted to share. Okay, can I get a thumbs up from the panel if y'all can see things? Okay, great. So we have been blessed by being given the opening key conversation at the SumC Summit this year. And this topic has allowed us to explore our work lives in a variety of ways in the roles that we currently sit in, and wanted to kind of take you through a couple of data anecdotes that have been really pivotal for our understanding of this topic. So I'm going to allow my panelists to introduce themselves in a minute through their own slides, but you'll get to hear from Eva, who's the Deputy Chief Data Officer at the Mayor's Office in Los Angeles, Rebecca Williams, who is a Technology and Public Purpose Project Fellow at Harvard Kennedy School, and Margo Dawes, who is the new Mobility, Data, and Equity Strategic Advisor at Seattle DOT. So a quick intro about me so you know who I am and where I'm coming from. I'm a designer and a planner. My parents emigrated to the US to Flushing in New York in the 80s. So I am a first generation Taiwanese American. And the work that I do, I founded Remix about 7 years ago to design better tools for transportation planners. And fast forward a number of years, we now work with about 400 cities around the world, and we were actually acquired by VIA in March 2021, so just a few months ago. The 3 things that drive me, I would say human-centered design of the built environment, bringing my whole self to work, as you can tell already, and also deep fear of climate change. So the first data story that I wanted to share with you all is an example from Caroline Corrado Perez's Invisible Women book. It's about snow clearing and if the concept of snow clearing can be sexist. And the answer is yes, wholeheartedly. The existing societal power structure in this example was during winter in Sweden and in probably most snowy places around the world, cities plowed major highways first and big surface streets next, and walkways and bike paths absolutely last. There was actually a gender equity panel or committee in Sweden where they did some data analysis and discovered that 79% of the pedestrian injuries that occurred during winter, of that 79%, 69% were women, 2/3 of which were actually individuals slipping on ice. And what they discovered was that this existing societal practice actually disadvantaged women because they were the ones who were more likely to walk and travel with children, while men who were predominantly working and commuting benefited from those major corridors being plowed first. And what was exciting about this example is not only the data discovery, but there was actually an action or a solution that was enacted pretty soon afterwards. And in 2012, a number of cities in Sweden adopted a gender equal plowing strategy where actually first pedestrian cycle lanes were cleared, especially near schools and daycare centers, and then later on major streets. And throughout this practice, they gathered data, and by clearing those walking paths, pedestrian paths first, accidents actually decreased by half. So this was really a fascinating example that I wanted to kind of ground this group in. The second example, data story 2, is about correlation between car crashes and race. And this example comes from the Data Feminism book and also the Detroit Geographic Expedition and Institute, DGEI, which no longer exists, but did some really fascinating work in the 60s as a collaboration between community organizers in Detroit and academic geographers from Michigan State and other nearby universities. Basically, there was a community that was sitting kind of in between the richer suburbs, Grosse Pointe Woods, et cetera, in the Detroit region and downtown. And there was a lot of commuter traffic between the affluent white suburbs through downtown Detroit, through this Black community, and traffic violence was everywhere. On a single corner, about 6 children were killed in 6 months. No one was really keeping detailed records of these deaths, and none of it was publicly available. So in 1968, the DGEI folks basically came together and created a map, many maps actually, to visualize racial inequity, and discovered that there was a way that they could actually talk to community members and actually plot out where these deaths were happening. And they published this map, which is actually quite fundamental to geography today. It's called Where Commuters Run Over Black Children on the Points to Downtown Track. And you can see along these commuter routes where these clusters of traffic violence deaths were happening. And by mapping them for the very first time, they were able to bring exposure to this problem that was only known in the community and not known to anyone else. So that is data story number 2. And next I will hand it over to Eva.
Thanks, Tiffany. Good morning, everyone. I'm Eva Pereira. I'm the Deputy Chief Data Officer for the City of Los Angeles, and I'm excited to be here today. I'm a data scientist and data advocate and a public servant. I'm also a first-generation American who grew up in South Florida. My father is from Haiti, my mother is from Germany, and grew up in the melting pot that is South Florida. And I'm just really passionate about social justice issues and advocating for them as much as I can at City Hall, and really seeing that our programs and services are as equitable as possible. So the work that I do, I'm the Deputy Chief Data Officer, like I said. My team leads data projects for the mayor's office and also for departments. We also manage the city's open data portal, and we oversee some data governance initiatives for the city. And 3 things that drive me. So this map that you're looking at is actually a map of historically redlined communities in Los Angeles. And overlaid on top of that is present day disadvantaged communities as determined by the state of California. So as you can see, there's a fair amount of overlap there. And that just shows you the intergenerational legacy of redlining and discrimination. It doesn't stop in the moment in time that the policy ends. A lot of times there's a legacy that lasts through many generations. So 3 things that drive me: promoting equity in programs and service delivery, expanding access to opportunity, and really just challenging the status quo whenever possible. So this first project that I want to talk about today is a data story about our census outreach work. So during the 2020 census, we were in a very challenging position. The Trump administration had politicized the census and had attempted to add a question around immigration status, which many experts felt would lead to an undercount, especially in major metro areas. So there was a lot of fear and just confusion around the census that cities were combating going into it. And then COVID hit and made it even more difficult to do the outreach work to get folks to complete the census form. So it was a very challenging year to conduct a count. And LA has just historically been a hard to count area. So, during the 2020 census, we had about a group, sort of like a SWAT team in the mayor's office, to meet weekly to discuss, where are areas of the city that are very far behind in response rates, and what are the community-based organizations that we can partner with in those areas to get out the word, answer any questions or fears that people have about completing the census, and connect them also with resources that they need. This is a really challenging time. So the data discovery in doing that was that low-income neighborhoods that were severely impacted by COVID were some of the neighborhoods the farthest behind in the response rate. So like I said, we partnered with those community-based organizations, and we also made sure to connect people with, city resources for COVID. So, whatever programs or services they need access to, we saw that as, an opportunity to raise awareness about, support that's available. So that's my first data story. Great. And then the second data story, so I wanted to shine a spotlight on a really exciting project that LA Metro is working on. So they're currently working on a free fare pilot that, I think is really exciting. Public transportation, my father was a civil engineer and is a huge advocate of public transportation. And it really is key to promoting economic mobility and access to job centers and opportunity. It's such an important facet of a city. And I think this free fare pilot is really exciting. So LA Metro did a survey that showed about 70% of customers had an income of less than $35,000. And furthermore, 51% live below the federal poverty line. So they have a customer base that is, extremely, cash strapped and financially stressed. So the solution and action proposed was a 23-month pilot for low-income residents. So the goal is to assess over this 23-month period, how LA County can support equity and how this free fare program benefits low-income riders. So just wanted to shine a spotlight on some really exciting work from LA Metro and call that out here today.
Thanks, Eva, for sharing. We'll hand it over to Rebecca next.
Hello, everyone. Am I showing up on the screen? It's so hard to tell. I'm Rebecca Williams. I'm a white woman wearing a white button-up shirt with shoulder-length blonde hair and gold earrings. Maybe more importantly, I'm a researcher and writer. I've been in the policy space for a while. My background in terms of education was law and city planning. I was drawn to city planning issues because my home city, Springfield, Massachusetts, was always sort of struggling economically or with crime. It's always like on a top 10 struggling city list, but certainly informed how I think about public administration, community organizing, everything like that. In terms of what I like to do when I'm not thinking about cities or data, I enjoy book clubs. I do a lot of art projects in like museums, and I also enjoy my dog, who might pop up, but she's being good right now. The work that I do, after all that liberal arts training, I did a series of data jobs in and outside of government, across subject matters. I did some energy policy, some affordable housing, went down to DC, spent time in the federal space. My most recent work that relates to this presentation more directly was for Harvard Kennedy School's new fellowship oriented around technology and public purpose. I researched smart city risks. So what can go wrong with smart city technology? In terms of what drives me, understanding incentives and trends. Some folks might know me from tracking open data laws years ago. Seeing that sort of trend bubble up and continue on was interesting. I think the same way we're seeing a lot of different policies, such as facial recognition technology, bans and things like that occur right now, but just sort of noticing what is happening and what will happen, and trying to reckon with why that's happening motivates me. Democracy and community motivate me. How do we make sure that folks in the community are actually having a voice in what's happening in terms of public sector administration? And then lastly, justice and uncovering bait and switch scenarios. And in law school, there were a lot of land use zoning cases, and just sort of understanding sort of like the coded language to sort of keep folks out and how those were challenged legally was really interesting to me, and it's still interesting. In terms of data stories, I couldn't pick exactly one, and these are directly from my latest research with Harvard Kennedy School, and the final report should be out very shortly, so folks can go check that out. But a couple of trends. So I wanted to highlight, I think throughout this presentation and perhaps throughout this conference, you're going to hear a lot of examples of how data can be helpful for efficiency or to uncover injustice, illuminate differences. But I think data can itself be the problem. So I wanted to highlight some examples of how mobility data is so powerful now at identifying or re-identifying people. It can target them, and then with that sort of targeting power, make sort of past discrimination even worse. So the first sort of set of examples is vehicle data, and some highlighted stories that have happened in the last year related to vehicle data. Some of it is related to automatic license plate readers, and some of it's related to vehicle telematics directly in the car themselves. But there's been like an increase, an upward trend of using these more affordable technologies. A lot of automated license plate readers are just being attached to older CCTV cameras now, but hooking up that automated license plate readers to tracking folks down if they're uninsured or if they haven't paid court fees. So what this does is exacerbate what many policy scholars have argued criminalizes the poor. A lot of the sort of incentives to pay fines if you can't pay them anyway, it doesn't sort of help. A particular example in Oklahoma, they're trying to put out the uninsured driver license plate readers throughout the entire state. And that's like the first time they're doing it like statewide. And it's also been more expensive for the state to implement than the return they're getting on sort of the investment. The other example is car data. So now that vehicles have more data to produce and have many computers within them, there's a series of third-party data broker sellers that will sell this data to a variety of third parties, advertisers, et cetera. But also it's been linked to military operations, not just in the US, but globally. And that can be linked to immigration enforcement or anything in terms of national military operations, which is a bit scary and interesting to think about at a mobility conference. So the next set of stories where data might be the problem, and this set is, I like this because it reinforces the story that also the issues that we discuss here are global issues. So the other big sort of set of location data tracking that might be going on with your scooter app or your rideshare application or any sort of application you have on your phone is cell phone location tracking. And some of that goes on not only without the cell phone owner's knowledge or consent per se, but also through these embedded software development kits inside of apps. And then you can track like across apps, or it's just like, it's a much more insidious tracking that can also be used in this case to track Muslims globally. So those examples exist in the United States, like right in our backyard for immigration police, going through and looking at Muslim prayer apps that use location data to make sure that folks are like sitting and pointed towards Mecca, to some targeted network shutdowns in Thailand. If you were in sort of the Muslim area of Thailand and you had used facial recognition technology on your SIM card, they could confirm you're Muslim and then just shut your phone down directly. And then, of course, the larger concerns about internment camps with the Uyghurs and Xinjiang. They also use phones for that and location tracking. And I think it's important to sort of talk about all of those together as like this is happening globally. It's not sort of hypothetical. There are worst case scenarios happening. And how do we reckon with that as we try to collect more and more data for collective mobility goals if your startup is also used in other countries or could be used nefariously? So that's, I hope folks have in the back of their mind, how could all of this collection target people? Thanks, Tiffany.
You're muted, Tiffany.
Thanks, Rebecca, for offering that perspective. Not a super warm and fuzzy one, but something that we obviously need to consider when we're using the data that we do have. And I will turn it over to Margo to share her thoughts.
Thanks, Tiffany, and thanks, Rebecca. I do appreciate the focus on data weapons. I always appreciate when people help us remember that data is not an objective reality, but a tool that you use to accomplish your aims. So just reminding us how it can be used as a weapon is really helpful. Hello, everyone. I'm Margo Iñiguez Dawes. I am a brown Latina woman with shoulder-length brown hair and gold glasses, which I think are evocative of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, but you can let me know if you agree. I am a public servant and a queer brown Latina. I'm from Maryland, lifelong East Coaster living on the West Coast. And I've got a bunch of cheesy selfies here on my intro slide. And I really like to, in panel discussions, kind of like make it more personal. So I'm gonna tell you who's in these photos, like you're sitting in my living room and we're looking at old snapshots. So in this first photo, this is me with my buddy, Yes Segura, who is a local transportation expert and has his own consulting firm called Smash the Box. Check it out if you're in Seattle. I'm calling it from Seattle here. And this is us at Trans Pride, the year that I moved to Seattle, 2018. The work that I do is, I work in government. I've worked in transportation departments, starting with the US Department of Transportation, and now I'm at the Seattle Department of Transportation. And I really see my role as a public servant in these large public institutions to get these institutions to really account for their roles historically and to the present day in contributing to an unjust society. And what that accounting looks like in practice is learning about and applying racial equity frameworks to all of the work that I do, and doing that in partnership and in like a space of continual learning and growth with my peers as well as stakeholders. And some of the peers that are pictured here are my department's Race and Social Justice Change Team, which I've been on since I joined the department in 2018. And this is us at our 2020 retreat, so just a couple months before COVID resulted in us not seeing each other in person to this day. So this is us together, and this is really my community of practice. The people with whom I again, learn about those racial equity frameworks, learn about how to apply them to our work, and then guide others in our department in applying those to all of our work. And some of the things that drive me are my community and my family, and there's really blurred boundaries between those. And I'm really blessed to be part of many communities that I would say are loving communities that are deeply committed to one another's spiritual growth, to borrow a definition of love from bell hooks. And you can see here in this photo, I've got some of my peers from a mentorship program that I was in a couple of years ago with Tiffany, in fact, and you've got from left to right, me choosing in the middle, but you've got Liz, Destiny, Ambar, Linda, Vianney, Naomi, Tiffany, and Amar hanging out in this picture in LA. This was days before COVID shut down travel and seeing each other in person. So again, the community and holding each other accountable and investing in one another's spiritual growth is really, really critical to me. But I'm also really committed to the redistribution of wealth and power, societally speaking. That's what I believe my role in government is. And I think governments do that all the time. And it's just a matter of changing who we are redistributing wealth and power to and from. And I'm really deeply committed to solidarity, real, meaningful, non-performative solidarity across lines of race and class for the sake of our collective liberation. And I am picking to share with you all today 2 data anecdotes or data stories that come out of things that I actually just learned 2 weeks ago in my job. So I'm learning something new and interesting kind of every day, every week at my work, and I wanted to share the most recent stuff that I have with you all. So in our scooter share pilot in Seattle, like our bike share work as well, we at SDOT require vendors to produce or to provide low income, reduced fare programs for accessing these shared mobility pilots. And what we learned recently in seeing what the utilization of those looked like is that less than 1% of riders actually make use of this option, but those that do are super users, and they account for up to 11% of the trips taken in a given month. So if the average, if overall, people are taking about 1 or 2 trips each on a monthly basis, the people using the reduced fare programs are taking 6 times that, upwards of 10 to 15 trips each per month. And in a recent month, even taking around over 40 trips each per month, which to me shows that, and to us, the way that kind of we're interpreting this, and this connects right back to what Eva was talking about earlier with the free fare programs, is that when something is free or extremely discounted, people are going to make use of it a lot more. And what that challenges, or what this sort of anecdote challenges is something that I work in a lot. I'm work in the new mobility team, have worked in the new mobility space for a few years now. And new mobility modes in general are really, and this is bike, scooter, car share. We can even think about electric and automated vehicles in this respect, but they're really designed for people who are already flush with options. They're designed with sort of a dominant, higher income person in mind, and for people who are willing to pay for a little bit more convenience. And our work in the new mobility space has been focused on how to really make those options work for the people that they're not designed for, to actually contribute to broader mobility, more equitable mobility, as well as the sort of necessary investments that we're going to need to make in expanding options for people who don't have as many options if we are going to achieve the mode shift that we know that we will need to achieve, from fossil fuel-based modes to more electric modes. And I'll move on to the next one here. This is also just something that I learned really recently in our reimagining community safety work, which our Vision Zero team here at SDOT has been leading. But the power structure here is obviously that white folks can get almost anywhere that they need to go without being stopped by the police. They have a certain freedom of mobility that Black and brown folks do not have. And what we learned when we were looking into some of the ticketing data, particularly in the context of we were looking into this in the context of our helmet law in Seattle and King County. But what we found was really fascinating to me, which is that Black folks are ticketed by the police kind of across modes, driving, walking, and biking at a rate 3 times higher than their proportion of the population. And they're charged 5 times as high as that proportion. White folks are ticketed proportionally, and Asian, Pacific Islander, and Native American folks are ticketed at a rate lower than their percentage of the population. Though when you dive in further, the Native American, Alaskan Native folks are charged at a rate 3.5 times higher than their proportion of the population. And all of this race data is reported by the police, who are not asking people for their race, but making their own judgment based on how someone looks. And because Hispanic and Latino people are difficult to clock, the police just don't collect that data. There is no separate category for Hispanic or Latino. They're just lumped in with white or whatever. So that's also just an interesting thing to note about it. And what can we do about this? I'm here representing the city of Seattle, so I can only say what the city of Seattle thinks that we should do about it, but you may have your own thoughts. But one of the things that we're really thinking about, and this is straight out of our transportation equity framework, which is a community guided document that is coming out later this summer. But we're really looking into decriminalizing transportation and decoupling transportation from policing as best we can. And the helmet law that I referenced earlier is just one of the ways that we might be doing that.
Thank you, Margo, for sharing your department's really strong work in this area. And we're a little bit over time for this section, so I am going to shift us back into discussion and Q&A mode. And my first question is for Eva, actually. So, open data portals have been around for a little while. I feel like there was that big movement kind of earlier in the decade when I was at Code for America. Open data portals were kind of the thing for cities to latch onto to demonstrate transparency. So my question is, I imagine your team is really seen as a hub for data related work across the city cross-functionally. Can you speak to a few examples of data that you've come across that should definitely 100% be available to the public on every city's open data portal? And on the flip side, what are some types of data that maybe should not be on data portals and why?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, rather than pinpointing a single data set that I think should be made available, I actually want to answer a slightly different question, which is, something I'd like to add to every data set is, I think it's really important going forward to start adding demographic data whenever possible, and geospatial data as well. Because I think that you can really start to peel back the layers of the onion and understand a deeper story of what's happening as it relates to any of the programs and services we're running. When you start to look at demographic data, race or gender or even socioeconomic status, that starts to paint a very different picture about things that are happening in our communities. So I would say that that's something I'd like to see added to data sets going forward. Whenever possible, try to disaggregate the data demographically.
So to build on that a little bit, Eva, it kind of reminds me of the census example that you were bringing up around demographics of people who feel comfortable and don't feel comfortable responding to the census, and the level of granularity that the census currently captures. For example, I think for a long time and even today, the census does not capture folks under, Middle Eastern descent. It is very confusing what box Middle Eastern folks should be checking. And you with, a Haitian German background, I imagine you must be wanting to check multiple boxes, and how does that show up in data? I'm curious, can you speak a little bit, and maybe Rebecca, you can chime in as well, around the responsibility of the census to capture demographic data, and at what level of granularity is the right one?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting question, because there's so much that's not captured by the census questions and the categories that are laid out currently. There was a really interesting study back in 2016 in LA called The Color of Wealth that looked at just the difference in wealth by race and ethnicity in Los Angeles. And they found that within the Asian community, there are vast disparities in wealth. And so I think there's a lot that's being masked by the current categories. So, possibly disaggregating them further would enable us to tell, a more granular story about what's happening in our cities.
Yeah, I think there's certainly like a number of examples of cities not collecting information because they don't have to deal with the inequitable challenges. I think maybe a more famous example, I think it was Chicago, it could have been another city, stopped collecting stop and frisk demographic data, because then they wouldn't be challenged by local ACLU chapters because there'd be no data. You wouldn't know that it was more African Americans being stopped. So I think there is a lot of power in connecting demographics, but to like the point about sort of data weapons and targeting, if you start collecting sensitive information, and a lot of demographic information is sensitive, like someone might not want to share their orientation or like a detailed history of their genealogy for like a number of reasons. They might not want that linked to their Metro card. So I think it like a higher level question is really like, why are we not talking to community members about collective goals? And one of those collective goals might be a better understanding of where some of this inequity arises. I think too, yeah, those are the 2 points. I think it's really important to collect, and you see non-collection as a weapon as much as collection. But I think the community should be directly involved, especially folks that don't feel comfortable with when and how they want to share that. Maybe it's for a discrete study by a third-party university. They don't want to give it to the government directly. They don't want to give it to someone that might enforce it directly. And that could be a happy middle ground, but I think it's a double-edged sword.
Yeah, for sure. Following that thread about communicating with the community about collective goals, Margo, it sounds like I know for a fact you do a lot of work in the community, and you spend a lot of time thinking about and working with stakeholders, both community-based organizations as well as city leadership and elected officials. Those are 2 very different audiences who need to be bought in different ways in order for new projects such as new mobility to be implemented successfully. Can you speak to your experience around what types of data you found most compelling for engaging with the community and doing public engagement versus what types of data are most effective when presenting to city leadership and elected officials?
Yeah, definitely. I think, everybody is moved by good data storytelling. And that's something that, we're all learning a lot more about in recent years, about just, compelling storytelling. But I will say, I referenced the transportation equity framework, which is led by this transportation equity work group that SDOT has convened and compensated for the last couple of years to develop an agenda of, value statements and strategies about like how we as a transportation department can be doing our work differently. There's that, and there's another project that I'm running right now where I would say that community stakeholders, just regular folks who have some stake in how the transportation department operates are still much more still resonate much more with qualitative data and individual stories and experiences, quotes, that type of thing, not less quantifiable information. And they want to know what we already know and like how to enrich our understanding with narratives and first-person accounts and priorities and experiences, that type of thing. And elected officials and department leadership and that type of thing are still much more convinced by and moved by hard numbers. So it will remain a balancing act, I think, for a lot of us in roles like these to have both. To have the hard numbers to move the elected officials and the qualitative information that community stakeholders, I feel like don't feel as though their voices have really been heard until or unless they see a voice represented in our data and what we consider to be data that they can really relate directly to.
Thanks, Margo. So we've got about 14 minutes left. I'm going to ask one more question to the group, and then I will start curating from the Q&A. So feel free to post any questions that you've written down there. So my last question is around the downstream effects of what is called privilege hazard, which is aka the risks incurred when people from dominant groups create most of our data products. Is not only that data sets are biased or unrepresentative, but that they never get collected at all, which has been evidenced by many data stories in this session so far. Eva, you already mentioned getting additional breakdown data about demographics more specifically to understand impacts. As you go about your jobs, let's say, later today, is there one key missing set of data that you feel like should be collected or should be spotlighted or should be considered more significantly than it is today that this audience should know about?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that I'm really digging into. I think I think going forward, one data set I'd really like to see, I'd love to get more qualitative data, like qualitative data around a lot of the programs and services that we run. I'd love to do more focus groups where I can just survey members of the community to understand, what are the pain points, what are the obstacles to access, what are the obstacles to opportunity, and start to dig into that data a bit more. That's very expensive to do. And that sort of engagement, done properly takes a lot of time and is expensive. So that's one thing I would love to just, do a bit more. So that would be on my wish list.
I can go here. I think as we think about mode shift and electrifying mobility and all of that, one thing that I come back to a lot is that we really need to be encouraging people who have a lot of options to pick the socially and environmentally best options, and that involves incentives and all manner of carrots and sticks. But at the same time, we need to recognize that there are folks who still lack options, who have been pushed out of the city for affordability reasons in places like Seattle. It's different from city to city, into areas that have less good or fewer options for transportation than they might have had if they had been able to afford to stay here. And that using those same incentives that we use on group A, on group B is kind of changing the rules kind of as we go, which is typical and to be expected. But if we want to do things differently, then we need to work on investing in mobility for this group B, regardless of what mode they are using primarily, and also invest in expand the options available to them. So I feel like to answer your question about like what data we need is to like really be able to divide or like enrich our understanding of who has what options and who is relying on, you know, just one or two different options, and what is like the, you know, for that latter group, what is the like most meaningful investment in expanding mobility options that we can make in these next 10 years, so that we're not messing with people as we work to really shift the way that we're running the transportation system.
My answer to this question is just more procurement and spending and budget data in most local governments in the US. It's all follow the money stuff. I think all of the solutions sort of like desired, and Benji's complaint about the highway that we have to tear down. We're gonna need resources, or he didn't say tear down, those are my words, but we're gonna need resources to do that, and really sort of being able to sort of track what we're spending money on. And also like a good question there is, I doubt this is the case in any city, but maybe I'm wrong. If we're spending more money collecting homeless data than giving things to the homeless, that is a problem. Like data is not so perfect that like we should be focusing on that. So I think the more granular and user-friendly we can get with budgets and procurement includes subcontractors, which I know government officials want as well, not just sort of the public, but really understanding where our resources are going is how we can get better mobility goals.
So I'm gonna take a look at the Q&A, and it looks like the first couple of questions are actually around the LA Metro pilot, Eva. So I'm gonna combine Akshali Gandhi and Mackenzie Love's questions around the free fare pilot. If 70% of riders would potentially qualify for the free fare pilot, how would the agency propose making up the cost from lost fares? And what metrics will be used to evaluate the success of the pilot? If you're able to speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, it's my understanding that they're currently exploring, first of all, how to fund the program long term. So that's one of the questions they hope to answer over the 23-month pilot, is just a model for sustaining this long term. And, you know, what would the cost be to sustain this long term? And then on top of that, you know, the impact on low-income riders. So does this increase the amount of low-income riders and, I guess, ridership overall of our public transportation system? So I know that they're, you know, currently doing a lot of work just scoping out the pilot a bit further, but you know, I know that those are some of the questions that are top of mind.
And then I'm going to ask a question from Mehul Malhotra, which is, how important do you think data collection is for services that aren't quote unquote popular or formal, like informal transportation services in cities like LA, the camionetas, or New York, the dollar vans? And maybe how do you think cities can push for this to try to improve equity? I almost want to invite Benji back to the stage because he has a whole newsletter on informal transportation. So Benji, if you want to chime in, or if anyone else in the group here has an opinion on this one.
I'll let Benji take it, but I think it's very important. And I think also not just sort of dollar vans, but also Uber and Lyft and all these other sort of disruptive non-government transit devices. To get the whole picture, you need all of that information. I think you can do it through studies though. You can do like little proxies and it doesn't have to be a constant tracking of every dollar van. Maybe you don't want that.
I will pipe in because you invited me, but with just one quote, which is one of my favorite quotes in the world from Slum Dwellers International. And I'm a broken record on this. The first act of inclusion is to be counted. And I'll disappear again.
Yes, that is a very resonant quote. It actually originates from feminist geographer Joni Seeger, what gets counted counts, which is kind of an underlying fundamental question and statement of this whole panel. Okay, moving on to a question from Vipassana. A lot of the examples so far speak about data used to challenge power by city governments and journalists, or engaging using that data with the community. Do the panelists have examples of the community groups / publics being invested in open data / data collection? Thinking about Margo's examples where the community doesn't see their narrative reflected in the data. Margo, you're about to type an answer, so maybe you can speak to it too.
Yes, yeah, thank you. I was going to type it in case we didn't get to it, but great question, and the answer is yes. And the two examples that I can come up with are recent data collection efforts at SDOT. One about how people get around when they are not commuting, since we have so much commuting data, but we could use some more information about non-commute modes, as well as a data collection effort to inform new centralized dispatch option for wheelchair accessible vehicles. Something that we are doing in the city of Seattle more is inviting the stakeholders that we're attempting to collect data from to participate in more phases or stages of the data collection process, which includes inviting them in at the very beginning to actually design the survey or focus group instrument. So we talk about, and this is more, that we have more examples than just the two that I've listed, and this is like a growing practice, but to work with the people who are going to help us collect the data from the community, whether that's community liaisons or community-based organizations, and say, this is what we're trying to know, but what do you need to know? And this is what we think that we're trying to ask, but how do you think we should ask it? And getting a lot of really rich feedback on kind of our approach, our methodology, at the outset, has been a pretty effective method, and I would really recommend that increasingly at your different organizations.
So we have 3 minutes left. I'm going to ask 2 more questions, and then we will wrap up. So combining Mackenzie and Stephanie's questions around engagement in this time, have you found that the move to socially distanced technology-based engagement has driven participation up, down, or both? Does this differ across demographics and or intersectionality? What do you see the best balance between in-person and virtual to be going forward? And specifically for you, Eva, do you have any examples of cities that have done effective and replicable community engagement to understand mobility needs? What made it great?
I mean, I think anecdotally, I know that community engagement during COVID, I know that, I think a lot of the meetings that we were having previously in person were now more accessible to people who couldn't make it across town in LA traffic to arrive at a certain place at a certain time. So I know anecdotally, we've seen an uptick in just like, representation of people in some of our meetings, the diversity of those meetings, and just, the number of people attending. So that's, I think, been one like really great realization, is that having virtual events is much more accessible for a lot of folks. So that's one thing I think will continue going forward.
Yeah, I will say anecdotally, when I was a commissioner on the environment department in San Francisco, the sheer number of callers into the WebEx increased by probably 3 to 4x for public comment. And say what you will about public comment, there was definitely a more democratized platform in which people could just literally call in from literally wherever they are, from the playground, from their commute, from the sidewalk, from their living room, their kitchen. That's definitely, I would say, level the playing field for public comment specifically. Any other thoughts? I would say, if I could add just one concluding thought, I do really like this last question that Hannah posted in the comment in the chat. How can we help the public really understand and use data to include universal mobility? Depending on who is collecting and sharing the data, it can really skew the story, skew the real story. And I guess I'll extrapolate this to a broader concluding comment around universal mobility in general as kind of the smorgasbord of all the possible aggregation of mobility options that we have, and wanted to ask the panel, Benji included, if you have any thoughts on collecting data to support universal mobility.
I mean, I'll just chime in. I think there are a lot of different ways that we can collect data to improve universal mobility. One of the routes we took was working with an organization called SafeGraph during the pandemic. They have some mobility data that's anonymized. I think it's collected through anonymized cell phone pings. And so it'll tell you, travel to various points of interest. And, we used it during the shutdown to determine, percentage of people who were obeying the shutdown, the shelter in place orders. So there are a lot of different like data providers and data sources that can help inform those sort of questions.
I would chime in and just echo what Rebecca asked, and the experience also in Seattle is, let's ask the community, the people who need universal mobility. What is the information they need to be able to get around?
And with that, we are at time. Wanted to extend my gratitude to Rebecca, Margo, Eva, Benji, and Hannah for convening this. Really, just we're scratching the surface of this topic today. So thank you, and thank you to everyone who joined us. Back to you, Benji.
Thank you so much, Tiffany, and join me, attendees, in thanking the panel. That was really, really informative and enjoyable.